Hello everybody. I know it may seem a little bit odd to be talking about growing tiny tomatoes indoors right now, especially since now is when all those wonderful ripe garden tomatoes are happening. But after last year, I swore to myself that I would time out my indoor grow so that I had a continual supply of fresh tomatoes all the way through the fall and winter. So I am planning out my indoor grow now and testing some new micro dwarf tomato varieties to see which ones I like best so that I can be well prepared for growing this fall and winter. Today I'm going to share with you how I grow my micro dwarf tomatoes indoors and a few tweaks if you'd rather grow them outdoors instead, as well as a few exciting new varieties that I'm trying. So let's jump right into the process. The nice thing about micro dwarf tomatoes is that some of them, depending on the variety, can be grown in teeny tiny pots, as small as a 4-inch in some cases. Be sure to check the recommendations for the individual variety or varieties that you choose to grow, but most of the varieties I'm growing tend to do best in about a 6 to an 8-inch pot. But more important even than pot size is drainage. Make sure that whatever pots you choose, they have plenty of drainage holes on the bottom. Now for some of my container grown plants, I honestly don't give potting medium a whole lot of thought. I just kind of throw them in whatever I have on hand. But since these tomatoes are producing a relatively large amount of fruit in this compact little space, I really like to opt for a high quality potting mix when growing these. Today I'm using Glee potting mix, and if you caught my video on growing cabbages in containers, you've heard me talk about Glee before. Glee utilizes hydrofiber, a sustainable growing medium made from thermally refined pine bark, which is used by professional growers. It has a couple of advantages over typical potting medium in that it regulates water and disperses it as the plants need it, which leads to better root establishment and faster rooting. It's great for use with both indoor and outdoor plants. But what I appreciate most about this is that Glee offers proper drainage but doesn't dry out too quickly. Many of the potting mixes I've used in the past dry out ridiculously fast. The trouble is, I'm not great at remembering to water. I have killed more plants than I would like to admit by forgetting to water them. So Glee offers me a bit of forgiveness in the watering department. The flavor, texture, and overall quality of tomatoes is greatly affected by the nutrient and mineral content of the growing medium or soil that they're grown in. And I've found that feeding my tomatoes with a natural fertilizer containing not just NPK, but also micronutrients such as calcium, magnesium, boron, and zinc are important as well. I opt for Gurney's tomato food, which has a 4-4-3 ratio, as well as containing those important micronutrients. One thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to go too high on the nitrogen because you'll end up with big, lush, beautiful plants at the expense of fruit production. Another note on fertilizer, you'll probably notice that a lot of potting mixes have fertilizer mixed right in. I prefer using a potting mix that has little to no fertilizer because I like to customize with my own options. Glee does have some slow release fertilizer mixed in, but it's such a small amount that I find I can easily mix in my own without overdoing it on the nitrogen. And of course, we need our tomato seedlings. I prefer to start from seed under grow lights and transplant the seedlings into the larger containers I will grow them in. You could, in theory, start the tomatoes right in the pots you plan to grow them in, but I like the ability to tweak the potting medium and the fertilizer as my tomatoes grow. I prefer to start all of my tomatoes in a mix specific for seed starting, and I don't begin feeding until they have their first set of true leaves and are an inch or two tall. I mix the food into their water each time I water my seedlings. I started the seedlings of each of the 7 varieties I will be trialing about a month and a half ago. Tomatoes, even micro dwarfs, are quite vigorous and will reach transplantable size quite quickly. It's best to transplant these well before they start setting any blossoms. You can see on a few of these I'm already running behind. Usually any time after the seedlings are 3 to 4 weeks old is a good time to transplant. Now some optional supplies if you're growing your tomatoes indoors. First of all, a grow light. Now a good grow light can make or break your indoor grow. The best grow lights for growing tomatoes indoors are going to mimic natural sunlight and ideally have a mix of warm and cool light bulbs as each stimulates a different phase of growth in fruiting plants like tomatoes. I'm using the Optic LED G-Max 150 dimmable grow light, but there are plenty of options on the market. Look for something in the range of 5,000 to 7,000 Kelvin cool colored lights for foliage growth and 2,700 to 4,500 Kelvin warm colored lights for fruit and flower formation. The amount of light you give your tomatoes is very important too. You'll want to provide them at least 8 hours of light a day. I opt for a 12 on, 12 off cycle. Now, as a side note, there are even folks that claim you can grow these types of tomatoes successfully in a sunny windowsill. I do not have one single window in my home which is sunny enough to get my tomatoes to ripen to that peak fantastic flavor. But if you've got a southern exposure, full sun all day, wonderful sunny window in your home, it's worth a shot. But if you are using lights, keep in mind that the height at which you keep your light above your plants is going to vary depending on the specific make of light that you have. So definitely follow the manufacturer's instructions for growing things like tomatoes. Now, a fan is a second optional supply for an indoor grow. It is definitely not necessary, but keeping a small fan on your plants as they are growing can help both strengthen their stems, since they're indoors and they're not getting any kind of movement like they would in the outdoors. It can also help when it comes time for pollination, as that airflow can help move pollen and pollinate flowers. Also keep in mind that tomatoes are heat lovers. So if you're growing indoors and your home is consistently cool, especially during the winter time, or if you keep your air conditioner cranked in the summer, it may be worth looking into a little mini greenhouse setup indoors. Now, I just got this thing cheap from Amazon, and it's really not sturdy enough to be used outdoors, but it does work really, really well for growing my tomatoes indoors, as this, when I have this flap shut, this creates a nice, warm, insulated little environment for my tomatoes. So they're quite a bit warmer in here than they would be just sitting out in a room exposed. I start by filling my container 2/3 full with potting medium. With Glee, I make sure to fluff the stuff before adding it to my pots, as it expands to 2.5 times its compressed size. This 0.4 cubic foot bag expands to fill 25 quarts, the same as a standard bag of potting soil. The easiest way I've found to do this is just to dump the whole bag in a large container. It's much easier to fluff, and I can fill my pots over the tote and contain my mess. Next, I add my fertilizer. You'll want to follow the instructions for whichever specific fertilizer you choose, but with Gurney's tomato food, I add 2 tablespoons at planting time. The instructions actually say to also add 2 tablespoons when the tomatoes start setting fruit, but I find that with plants this size, 2 tablespoons at transplant plus the small amount of fertilizer that Glee does contain is sufficient. Now it's transplant time. I gently break up the root ball of my seedlings and place so that the top of the root ball will be just under the soil surface. And then I fill my container the rest of the way up with Glee potting medium. Then I water thoroughly. At this stage, I really saturate the soil. I give it 10 minutes or so to drain and settle, and then if needed, I top off the containers with more potting mix. Now I place under my grow lights. This particular light has adjustable intensity, so I generally keep it a bit lower until the plant starts setting fruit, at which point I increase the intensity. This, again, will vary depending on what type of light you're using, so follow the manufacturer's instructions for growing fruiting plants. You can, of course, grow these outdoors or in a greenhouse as well, but there are a few specifics to keep in mind. For best flavor and yield, pick a spot where your tomatoes are going to get full sun. Full sun helps the development of sugars, which will help give your tomatoes that optimal flavor profile at maturity. Keep in mind that microdwarfs that have been bred specifically for indoor growing often do not have the disease resistances bred into them that garden tomatoes do. If you live in an area with heavy disease pressure, take precautions to protect your plants. This may be as simple as keeping them far away from your garden tomatoes, which may spread disease, using a preventative spray program such as a copper spray to prevent fungal diseases, or, as I mentioned, growing them in a protected outdoor greenhouse. But one benefit to growing them outdoors is that your friendly garden pollinators will most likely take care of the pollination requirements for you. If you're growing indoors or in a greenhouse where there's no insect activity, you're going to need to hand pollinate. This can be achieved by keeping a strong fan on your plants to disperse pollen, vigorously shaking the stems when pollen drop is happening, or hand pollinating with a small, soft paintbrush. This last method is what I prefer because it ensures that I'm getting every single flower on my little tomato plants pollinated, therefore getting the heaviest fruit set on my plants. Now, in general, I've been told that these types tend to do better in pots or containers than they do in ground, but I personally have not tried growing them in ground. And of course, supplying your plants with a proper amount of water is extremely important. I aim for watering more deeply and less often. And with Glee specifically, as I mentioned, I won't need to water these as much as plants potted in standard potting mix. I wait till the top inch and a half of the soil is dry until watering again. Remember, with Glee, this root zone area will stay damp much longer than the top of the soil surface. So be careful not to overwater these. And a good standard practice for tomatoes in general is to try not to wet the foliage when watering, but water directly into the root zone, especially if you're growing outdoors. And voila, in 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the variety, we'll have delicious ripe fruit. And since my first fall frost is mid-October, I'm going to be wanting to start up my fall batch from seed right about now. I also wanted to share with you the varieties that I'm growing this go around. Micro-dwarf plants typically grow to 12 inches or less at maturity, and they produce small fruit. I'm not aware of any micro-dwarfs that produce anything larger than, say, like a large cherry. If you know of any, definitely let me know. But I like growing these micro-dwarfs indoors because they're small and compact and yet produce a relatively large amount of fruit for that small plant size. I'm growing a few old favorites of mine, which include Siam and Red Velvet, but I'm also trying 5 new varieties. These include Paunchy Fa, Pillar Catch Red and Pillar Catch Orange, Pillar Joy Red, and Sweet Sturdy Joe. And I will be sharing in a follow-up video how all of these varieties perform and a taste test as well, because ultimately that's the most important thing. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.